let's jump right into this explainer. We're looking at how a landlocked alpine nation, with virtually zero natural resources, somehow engineered its geography into an absolute economic fortress. It is a brilliant story of adaptation. We're talking about a place where literally every disadvantage was methodically flipped into a global advantage. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the Great Swiss Paradox, the fortress of neutrality, secrecy, kings and capital, time, precision, and farmers, the leap from dyes to global pharma, and finally, human capital. Let's get into it. Starting with Section 1, the Great Swiss Paradox and cultivating intangibles. So to really understand Switzerland, we have to start with what I think is the ultimate economic contradiction. How exactly does a country with essentially zero natural resources become one of the wealthiest on the entire planet? I mean, think about it. They have no oil fields, no coal mines, absolutely zero ocean ports. The answer to this is what we call the Swiss paradox. When you contrast that utter lack of physical resources with the staggering per capita income of over $80,000, their strategy becomes pretty clear. They had to cultivate intangible resources. They essentially engineered trust, precision, and human capital simply because the literal earth beneath their feet offered them nothing else. Moving right along to Section 2, the fortress of neutrality, or the strategic retreat. This whole story of adaptation actually kicks off with a brutal reality check. See, prior to 1515, the Swiss were an expansionist military power, totally famous for their fearsome infantry. But they suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of Marignano against superior French artillery, and that forced a massive realization. They simply couldn't win by force. So this sparked a 400-year strategic retreat. From the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia all the way to the 1815 Congress of Vienna, the world eventually recognized their absolute armed neutrality. By turning that incredibly mountainous terrain into a neutral, totally impenetrable buffer zone that all of Europe eventually came to rely on, they took their geographic isolation and transformed it into their greatest geopolitical asset. They didn't just hide behind the Alps, you guys. They literally monetized the peace that those mountains provided. Which brings us to Section 3, secrecy, kings and capital, engineering trust. Okay, so once you establish this neutral, impenetrable, safe zone, people naturally want to store their valuables there, right? But the origins of Swiss banking actually shatter modern assumptions. The famous 1713 Genevan privacy laws, they weren't built for shady tax evaders. They were actually a sovereign risk management tool. At the time, Genevan bankers were lending vast, massive sums to European royalty to fund their wars. If rival powers discovered the true extent of a monarch's debt, it could destabilize entire regimes. So secrecy was quite literally a diplomatic instrument. And taking it a step further, look at the 1934 Banking Act. While it famously and critically protected Jewish assets from the Nazis, historical consensus shows it was also enacted as a legal shield against really aggressive French and German tax authorities who were hunting down capital flight during the Great Depression. By making a breach of confidentiality a federal criminal offense, Swiss banks protected their depositors, sure, but also their own commercial interests from foreign government intrusion. Let's hit Section 4, time, precision, and farmers. Out of prohibition comes perfection. Now, while trust was being monetized over in the banks, absolute precision was born out of a really unlikely source, religious prohibition. Back in 1541, the reformist Jean Calvin instituted strict sumptuary laws in Geneva, essentially banning ostentatious jewelry. Well, stripped of their livelihood, Genevan goldsmiths found a clever loophole. Watches were considered practical instruments, not jewelry. So teaming up with highly skilled Huguenot refugees, they pivoted to crafting pocket watches. It was a brilliant way to turn a local crisis into a global luxury empire. And to scale this new empire, they developed an incredible division of labor known as the établissage system. Basically, Switzerland utilized idle farmers who were trapped by the harsh winter snows up in the Jura Mountains. While they were snowed in, these farmers meticulously crafted standardized watch gears right in their own homes. Then in the spring, those parts were collected, centrally assembled, and rigorously quality checked. This decentralized model beautifully blended high-volume mass production with totally unmatched, bespoke quality. Section 5. From dyes to global pharma, looking at the alchemy of Basel. So, just as watches came from a jewelry ban, Switzerland's dominance in pharmaceuticals grew out of something surprisingly toxic. You'd probably think Swiss pharma started in these pristine, glowing medical labs, right? It actually began in the mid-19th century with the pestilential stench of synthetic coal tar dyes for the silk trade. chemists realized they could use cheap tar residues from street lamps to produce vibrant dyes. Now, it was highly toxic. In fact, some early factories even faced criminal trials for arsenic poisoning. But eventually, all those chemical synthesis skills were redirected from coloring fabrics to formulating complex medicines. You might wonder how they caught up to the rest of Europe so fast. Well, here's a wild fact. Switzerland didn't even recognize product patents on chemical compounds until 1978. Local firms engaged in what critics vehemently called industrial piracy, and what the Swiss politely brushed off as competitive necessity. They freely reverse-engineered and copied foreign chemical formulations. This perfectly legal environment of imitation laid the groundwork for today's global pharmaceutical giants like Novartis and Roche, who, ironically, later became massive innovators in their own right once patent protections were finally introduced. That brings us to Section 6, Human Capital, the real engine of precision. We've seen how they engineered trust and precision, but the ultimate resource driving all of this is their people. And their approach completely flips the Western academic narrative on its head. In so many countries, university is pushed as the only real path to success. But in Switzerland, a massive 70% of young people, and we're including high achievers here, opt for foundational vocational training instead of the traditional academic route. The secret sauce here is their highly respected dual-track vocational education and training model, or VET. It seamlessly blends paid on-the-job host company experience with classroom theory. An apprentice might spend 3 days a week getting real, hands-on practice and actually earning a wage, and then spend 2 days in a vocational school learning theory. This triple learning environment completely erases the stigma of blue-collar work and ensures there are absolutely no dead ends. You can always bridge over to higher education later if you want to. And this system is exactly why Switzerland boasts one of the highest per capita incomes and lowest youth unemployment rates on Earth, consistently sitting comfortably below 4%. By having industry heavily involved in designing the curriculum, they make sure their workforce perfectly matches actual labor market demands. They aren't just out there producing degrees, they are producing ready-to-work professionals. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. Switzerland proves that a nation's true wealth isn't what's buried in the ground, it's how they adapt to the surface. If a small, landlocked nation could take military defeat, zero natural resources, brutal winters, and strict religious bans, and somehow alchemize all of that into an absolute fortress of global wealth, what could you build with the limitations you face today? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep learning.